Do you really think a violin is just a musical instrument? Then answer one uncomfortable question. Why, in a world that can copy almost anything, can we still not truly replicate the sound of ancient instruments? Why do the same shapes, the same wood, the same dimensions, the same varnish still yield a different result? Why have some research efforts suddenly been cut short? Why do the most valuable instruments lie not on stage for decades, but in closed collections? And why is there too much money, too much silence, and too many strange coincidences surrounding them? There are theories that sound like madness, that the great masters did not create everything from scratch, but were restoring someone else's technology. That sound in the past was not an art, but a tool of influence. That ancient violins, grand pianos, and even forgotten musical machines could be fragments of a lost civilization, one we're not told too much about. Today, you'll hear facts that will make the legend of genius masters seem far less simple. We'll examine why modern science still struggles with these instruments, who hunted for them during history's darkest periods, and what might lie behind the strange war of frequencies that's still debated today. You can print a copy of an ancient statue, assemble a replica of old clocks, recreate a painting layer by layer. But there's one thing modernity seems to stumble over again and again: an old violin. Not just one that looks similar, not just one carefully carved from the same spruce and maple, but one whose sound grabs you from the first note, unfolds with a strange depth, and leaves you feeling that inside that wooden body lies something more than wood, glue, and varnish. And here begins the most uncomfortable question. If today we have laser scanners, microscopes, spectrometers, computer modeling, and machines accurate to the micron, why can we still not fully restore the true voice of old instruments? Why can craftsmen replicate the contour, curve, thickness, and fit of parts, yet end up with a different result? Similar, high quality, sometimes even outstanding, but different. For years, we've been offered a beautiful and convenient version. There was a great master, a rare talent, a unique feel of the hands, a secret varnish, special wood, and almost mystical inspiration. The story sounds impressive, but it has too much romance and too little precision. Because a violin isn't just a piece of craftsmanship, it's an acoustic system where every tiny detail changes the outcome. A fraction of a millimeter in the top plate's thickness, fiber density, arch shape, body tension, mass distribution. There's no room for vague terms here. Physics is at work. And the closer you look at this instrument, the weaker the legend that everything can be explained by skill alone appears. The result is too complex. It too consistently eludes replication. So what we're facing isn't just the successful work of an old master. It's a much more serious puzzle. And if an answer exists at all, we must seek it not in pretty stories about genius, but within the sound itself, where pure mechanics of vibration, resonance, and form begin. Just remove the admiring epithets from this story, and what remains is not a symbol of an era, but a precise acoustic mechanism where everything hinges on calculation. A violin doesn't work as a beautiful object, but as a living system of vibrations. Sound isn't born at a single point. It's assembled from several processes at once: string vibration, response of the top plate, air movement inside the body, wave reflection from the back plate, and the delicate work of the sound holes. The slightest shift in any of these elements immediately changes the final picture. That's why talk of simple craftsmanship starts to crack here. The thickness of the top plate in great instruments doesn't vary randomly, but along a complex trajectory. In some places, the wood is carved slightly deeper. In others, it remains almost untouched. A difference of a few tenths of a millimeter can already shift resonance, weaken overtones, and make the timbre drier and poorer. Modern makers measure such parameters with instruments, perform hundreds of checks, build digital models. But even with near-perfect external similarity, they don't get the same voice. The strangest part is something else. The problem isn't that the copies turn out bad. Many are magnificent. The problem is that old instruments have a richer sound, more inner depth, more complex frequency layers, more of that very three-dimensional acoustic quality that's hard to describe, but easy to hear. Spectral analysis makes this especially clear. Where a new violin shows a smooth, understandable picture, an old one reveals a more complex and saturated structure. And here arises a question that's not so easy to dismiss. If it's not just about shape, nor the wood itself, nor vague talk of talent, then there must be another factor in the instrument, something that isn't on the surface. And before searching for it in secret archives or forgotten technologies, we need to test the most famous version, the one repeated most often, the legend of the secret varnish. This is where the most convenient version appears, the one used for decades to cover up the main failure in explanations, the secret varnish. It's called the lost key, an almost magical formula that supposedly turned an ordinary violin into an unreachable standard. It sounds impressive and works perfectly as a legend. The problem is, the legend doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The coding of old instruments has been studied again and again. Chemists have broken it down layer by layer, searched for rare components, compared compositions, reproduced samples in labs. Resins, oils, natural dyes, mineral impurities. None of this is a secret anymore. Formulas have been restored, analogs made, application methods replicated. But the result always hits the same wall. The varnish can be almost fully reproduced, but the sound cannot. And this is clear even without complex terms. An ultra-thin protective film can't explain the full depth of timbre, richness of overtones, and that very three-dimensional acoustic picture that sets old instruments apart. Yes, the coding affects the surface, the response, the preservation of the wood. But to suggest it creates the entire Stradivarius phenomenon is like explaining the power of a clock by the color of its dial. The more the varnish story is repeated, the more it seems not an answer, but a diversion. The solution lies deeper, in the material, the construction, in the very origin of the technology. And if so, the question extends far beyond a single violin, because the same strangeness suddenly begins to appear in other instruments, larger, more complex, and even less explainable. Step outside the violin, and the strangeness only intensifies. Because next to a chamber instrument, where one can still attribute everything to the delicacy of handcraft, a completely different object emerges, the grand piano. And this is not an elegant salon toy, but a colossal acoustic machine, where every mistake immediately turns into failure. Dozens of strings, colossal tension, the most complex striking mechanism, a body that must not crack under the strain, yet must not stifle the sound. Here, a beautiful legend about a master's inspiration is no longer enough. Here, engineering is required. The official history presents the development of the piano as a smooth path from simple to complex. First, early models, then improvements, then the gradual birth of the modern instrument. On paper, it all looks seamless. But if you examine the pace of this movement, an uncomfortable sensation of a leap arises. Too quickly, a wooden construction transforms into a system capable of withstanding monstrous tension. Too quickly, a complex mechanism with thousands of parts appears. Too quickly, a musical instrument becomes an object that already requires load calculations, a precise understanding of resonance, and very mature material science. What's important here is not the fact of development itself, but its density. One thing is centuries of trial and error. Quite another is an almost sudden arrival at a level where a design flaw breaks the entire instrument. To create such a system, it's not enough to be a good craftsman. One must understand how tension distributes, how wood behaves next to metal, how to preserve sound power without destroying the body. And the more closely you look at this leap, the harder it is to shake the thought that someone wasn't so much inventing as they were restoring already known principles. But if so, the next question arises. Where did the confidence even come from that this entire line of development is dated correctly, and that the instruments themselves are truly younger than the knowledge seemingly embedded within them? And here we arrive at the point where the entire coherent picture begins to noticeably wobble. Because any discussion about the origin of an antique instrument runs up not only against sound, form, and materials, but also against a date. We are told, this specimen was created at such and such a time, this one belongs to such and such a school, this one definitely belongs to the correct era. But as soon as you ask what exactly such confidence is based on, instead of a monolith, a set of methods with vastly different degrees of accuracy suddenly appears. The most famous of these is tree ring analysis, dendrochronology. A useful method, no argument. It allows us to understand when the tree grew. But a tree and a finished instrument are not the same thing. The raw material could have lain for decades. It could have been stored in a warehouse, passed from master to master, used much later. So, what we have before us is not the date of creation, but merely a lower boundary, nothing more. Another path is radiocarbon dating. It sounds solid, almost definitive, but in practice, its accuracy for such time frames is too blurred to confidently tie an object to a specific master, or even to a single generation. That leaves internal labels, inscriptions, stamps, archival records. And here begins the shakiest part. All of these can be replaced, re-glued, forged, clarified after the fact, or written into a desired legend, especially when reputation and huge sums of money are at stake. A strange picture emerges. The history of an instrument often looks solid only in the display case. Upon closer examination, it turns out that between the age of the wood, the time of assembly, and later attribution, there are too many gray areas. And if the chronology here is not as ironclad as commonly believed, then what gains particular value is no longer papers or famous names, but what is hidden within the material itself, where traces of the past cannot be relabeled. When the debate over dates and labels becomes too slippery, the only thing left that is hard to argue with in words remains: the material itself. Not the signature inside the body, not a beautiful story of owners, not a legend of a genius workshop, but the very wood from which the instrument is made. And it is here that the most troubling oddities begin. In detailed analyses of old violins, researchers again and again stumble upon things that fit poorly into the usual explanations about age, climate, and a fortunate choice of raw material. First of all, the density stands out. The wood of old instruments often has a noticeably lower density than modern samples of the same species. The usual explanation: cold climate, slow growth, narrow tree rings. But the more such comparisons are made, the weaker this argument becomes. Wood from the same regions and roughly the same time does not yield the same picture. So it's not just nature, it gets more interesting. Under magnification, the fiber structure looks as if the material underwent very fine processing. Cell walls are thinned in places. Internal channels are distributed not quite as one would expect to see in ordinary dried wood. This no longer resembles a simple effect of age. It feels as if the wood wasn't just preserved, but was altered. Carefully, deeply, almost imperceptible to the eye, but quite noticeable to instruments. And here, the version of accidental luck begins to crumble completely. Too many signs point to intervention in the very structure of the material. Not crude impregnation, not a surface coating, but something more precise. Something that changed the wood's response even before the instrument was assembled. And if so, then the question sounds different. Not who specifically was more talented than others, but where, in general, could an environment have been preserved where such knowledge was not considered impossible? And here, the trail unexpectedly narrows to one small point on the map of Europe. On the map of Europe, there are plenty of cities that were richer, noisier, more influential, and more closely connected to science than Cremona. Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples. There was money, workshops, trade, art patrons, access to rare materials and ideas. Logically, one would expect such centers to become the main forge of unsurpassed instruments. But history seems stubbornly fixated on another place. A tiny region, relatively modest by the standards of the era, suddenly produces a whole constellation of names that still sound like an unattainable standard. Too much converged in one point. Amati, Guarneri, Stradivari, Righieri. This is no longer a singular flare-up, but a dense concentration of knowledge, as if it's not about the random luck of a few talented families, but about access to the same source. The official explanation is familiar and convenient. A school, tradition, passing down secrets, apprenticeship, workshop culture. All of that is possible, but there is one problem. Such schools usually leave a wide wave of imitators, repetitions, and equivalent centers. Here, however, we see an almost anomalous localization, as if the key was located precisely there and almost nowhere else. Then Cremona begins to look not like a place of great invention, but a place of restoration, as if the masters were not working from a blank slate, but from templates, fragments of knowledge, traces of an older system that, for some reason, happened to be present in this very region. Perhaps in the form of artifacts, ancient objects, unusual materials, inherited designs or practices, whose origins no one could later honestly explain. And if this guess is even partially correct, then the very meaning of the entire story changes. What lies before us is no longer just a debate about who carved wood better. Before us is the trace of a much larger tradition, where sound was not a decoration of life, but a tool of influence. And it is from this point that the conversation about music ceases to be a conversation only about art. Allow this thought, and the familiar picture immediately shifts. Music, in that case, stops being mere entertainment, a decoration for festivities, or background for grand halls. It begins to look like a technology, not metaphorically, but literally, as a way to influence space, the body, a person's state. Today, this no longer sounds like pure fantasy. Science has long known that sound can alter the behavior of matter. Certain frequencies amplify vibrations, induce resonance, reconfigure a system's response. The same thing happens with a person. Only here, the role of the resonator is played not by wood or stone, but by the nervous system. This is precisely why ancient cultures so persistently linked sound not to leisure, but to action. Temple bells, ritual drums, singing bowls, long trumpets, choral singing in stone spaces. All of this was used far too often, not for beauty's sake, but for a specific effect. To gather attention, induce a certain state, heighten an experience, alter perception. Modern research confirms it. Rhythm and frequency do indeed affect breathing, heart rate, stress levels, concentration, and emotional state. And here, ancient instruments begin to look entirely different. If their acoustics are richer and more complex, if they generate a more saturated field of overtones, if their sound unfolds with particular fullness in old halls with deliberate geometry, then what lies before us is not merely a successful body shape. It resembles a system where the instrument and the space work together, as if they were created not separately, but as parts of a single design. Then it becomes clear why such things could be important not only to musicians. If sound is influence, if it is capable not just of pleasing, but of altering the listener's state, then the value of such artifacts extends far beyond the stage. And where real influence appears, there almost always appear those who wish to control that influence. The story grows even more unsettling when it turns out that the hunt for ancient instruments involved not only collectors, conductors, and wealthy music connoisseurs. Around them, large sums of money, closed-end funds, vanished specimens, and a strange concentration of interest from those who don't typically engage with art for the love of beauty surface all too often. The violins of the great masters lie for decades not on stage, but in vaults. Some are almost never played publicly. They are guarded as if the value of these objects is far greater than mere museum status. On the surface, everything can be explained by the market. A rare item, a high price, prestige, fear of damage. But the logic falters when it becomes clear how strictly access to full-fledged research is limited. Much is said about ancient instruments, but far from everyone is allowed to study them deeply. Some data is published, some disappears into archives, some never leaves laboratories and private reports. A strange situation emerges. We are constantly told of the greatness of these artifacts, but there is no rush to reveal everything that is learned about them. Even more suspicious is the ownership environment itself. Major museums, banking dynasties, investment funds, a narrow circle of ultra-wealthy owners. For them, it is not merely a cultural relic, it is an object of control. Like a painting bought not to look at every day, but to possess a key to something rare and closed off. And the more such instruments disappear into safes, the stronger the feeling that what we face is not the whim of rich people, but a long-standing habit of keeping such things away from the wider public. And if this is indeed the case, then what comes to the fore is no longer the question of origin, but the question of effect. What exactly is hidden in these instruments if access to them is so metered? And here the conversation inevitably leads to the most controversial topic of all: frequencies, tuning, and how music in general alters a person's state. Frequencies are the part of the story where the debate instantly ceases to be academic and becomes personal. Because here we are no longer talking about museum rarity or auction price, but about what sound actually does to a person in the moment of listening. We are accustomed to thinking music influences us only through melody, mood, and memory. But beneath that layer lies another, deeper one. Any tone is a vibration. Any tuning is a system of numbers. And when the numbers change, so does the effect itself. This is precisely why the topic of tuning pitch has always sparked so much debate. The difference between 432 and 440 Hz may seem small to the ear, almost negligible to an untrained listener. But the question is not whether the ear will detect 8 cycles of difference as a separate event. The question is the overall tuning of the entire musical system. When the reference point shifts, the tension of the sound, the character of the overtones, the sensation of density and internal pressure in the music all change. For one listener, it will be a barely noticeable shift. For another, a feeling that the sound either gently draws them in or, conversely, holds them in constant tension. And here begins the most uncomfortable part. If tuning can change not only the color of sound, but also the physiological response, then music ceases to be a neutral medium. It becomes a means of fine-tuning perception. It is no accident that there is so much debate, research, and almost religious conviction surrounding different frequencies. People sense that behind the dry numbers lies something more than a technical standard. Now imagine that old instruments were created under a different acoustic logic, for a different ear, for a different space, and for a different principle of influence. Then it is no surprise that part of their power is lost in modern tuning. And perhaps this is precisely why, alongside familiar instruments in old sources, entirely different, almost forgotten devices surface. Devices that today people prefer to speak of as rarely as possible. Beyond the familiar set, violins, cellos, harpsichords, grand pianos, old descriptions mention things that today sound almost like a scribe's error. Water organs, mechanical instruments that play without a musician, giant horns, stone resonators, complex systems of pipes capable of filling a space with sound so powerful it was compared not to music, but to a force of nature. Usually, this is dismissed as exaggeration, as the ancient author's love for striking imagery. But the strange thing is that such references appear too often and across too many different cultures to simply brush them aside with a wave of the hand. It creates the feeling that only a thin upper layer of a vast tradition has reached us, while everything else has either vanished or been pushed outside serious discussion. Somewhere, devices are described in which sound was produced not by a string or a membrane, but by a complex system of air channels. Elsewhere, huge stone objects are mentioned that functioned as tuned resonators. Some accounts tell of musical machines that could reproduce predetermined sequences without a performer. All of this seems too advanced for a world usually portrayed as cautiously moving from simple to complex. What's especially unsettling is something else. Almost this entire thread seems severed. There are fragments of texts, indirect evidence, traces, but no continuous chain remains. It's as if someone left us a set of pieces without assembly instructions. And then, old violins and grand pianos begin to look different. Not as the pinnacle of long development, but as late, simplified fragments of a much larger acoustic system, of which only what could still be used and passed hand to hand has survived. And if these fragments truly point to a lost tradition, then one final step remains. Not to argue over details, but to gather everything together. The unusual woods, gaps in chronology, local schools, closed collections, vanished instruments, and see what picture emerges as a whole. When all these lines converge at a single point, the debate about ancient instruments ceases to be a conversation about music in the usual sense. A very different picture comes into view. Not a history of smooth progress, where each generation, step by step, made the world more complex and intelligent, but the trace of something already complete, something that once existed and then almost disappeared. There are too many inconsistencies to calmly ignore them. The material behaves strangely. Dating leaves too many gaps. The finest examples are concentrated in one place, as if craftsmen weren't inventing anew, but were approaching someone else's legacy. The architecture of old halls seems to await precisely such sound, and the instruments themselves continue to be preserved as if their value isn't fully reducible to art or money. And then the main conclusion sounds much harsher than is commonly thought. Perhaps the violins of the great masters are not the peak of craftsmanship, but a late copy of something more ancient. Not complete knowledge, but a surviving fragment. Not the beginning of technology, but its echo. People of past centuries may not have created everything from scratch, but restored what had already been discovered by someone earlier. From fragments, from traces, from surviving examples. That is why they came so close, yet did not pass on the full understanding to posterity. And if that is so, then the history of music is only part of a much larger story about a lost acoustic science, about knowledge in which sound was not an ornament of life, but a tool for affecting space, body, and consciousness. Perhaps we are not moving forward as confidently as we're used to thinking. Perhaps we are only slowly finding the key to a door that was once already open. If this investigation has made you look at music in a completely different way, please like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss future content. And be sure to write in the comments which part of this story seemed most unsettling to you. See you in the next video.